You figured it out?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's say, I mean, we're looking at these images, right? There's two things that are happening here, and we can explore both. You see how the structure of these buildings, a lot of times with these really complex forms, the structure is very simple and rationalized. Typically, it's a series of rib systems and then panelization on top of it, right? We're going to go over panelization in environmentals next week, but we can also do it in Maya. And there's different pros and cons to both. But the other thing is the rib system, right? So creating these complex rib systems can be really, they can be a pain depending on the software you're using, especially if you finish the building and you want to modify it or you want to like change one thing. You have to modify the whole thing unless you're working in something parametric like Grasshopper. So I can either show, so let's just start with that. I'm going to show you guys how you can basically create a parametric rib system in Maya, and then you can animate it over time and start to explore different options. So let's just start a new scene, start fresh. And I'm gonna go really slow, okay? So the first thing we wanna do is we wanna create a cube, right? That's typically always what we're gonna do. The next thing I wanna do is I wanna create a curve. So if you can imagine that rib, right, would probably be like a U shape, right? So let's go ahead and make a U curve. For this, I'll probably work in top view. So I'm just hitting spacebar. My mouse is hovering over the top view, spacebar again, right? So if I want to switch screens, spacebar, mouse hover over, spacebar. I'm then going to go to create curve tools, and I'm going to do a, let's do a CV curve. I'm going to start my curve here, and I'm just going to draw kind of like an arch, right? And then I'm going to hit enter. The next thing I'm going to do is I want to extrude this face across this curve. Do you guys remember how to do that?
Yeah, right click, selected.
So we have the curve selected, right? So W to get into the move command. We're going to select the curve. We're then going to right click on the cube and select face mode. And then with shift selected, hit face. So we're selecting both. I'll do it one more time. So I'm going to make sure W on the keyboard is selected. Again, if you don't know like W versus E versus R, you can find them on the side, right? This is the move tool. This is the rotate tool. This is the scale tool. Notice they have the shortcut there for you, right? R, E, W. So if you forget. So I'm going to select my curve. I'm going to hover over the cube, and I'm going to right click and select face. And then I'm just going to hold shift to make sure I select the face with the curve.
Why am I not getting the face option when I right click? I mean, like circuit point, isoprime.
Because you might not be quick. You make sure your mouse is hovering on the cube whenever you hold right click. Because if you select, so are you getting this?
No, I'm getting surface point, isoprime, surface touch.
You might not be in the move tool.
Am I in the right?
Hit escape. And then, yeah, you have some tool turned on that I don't even know what that is.
And modeling.
So let's just hit W on the keyboard. Okay, so I'm going to go object mode, and I just click off. Maybe press delete. Consider your dimension geometry there. Oh, okay. So what you did? So there's a difference between if you go to.
Oh, I just made this cube. Is that different?
Yeah, so that's a NURBS cube. We're going to do a primitive. So a NURBS, if you guys remember, is just a mathematical approximation and typically made up of poly surfaces.
The same as the ones. Okay.
So what that is, it's like 4 meshes that are combined to create that cube, but they're not technically like linked.
It's not a primitive actually.
Right. Okay, so has everyone else got it? So we're gonna right click, face, and then we're gonna bridge, right? So we're gonna go to edit mesh, bridge. And, oh, sorry, not bridge, guys. Extrude. Sorry. Control E to extrude, right? And before I fix this, just notice when you get this dark color on your primitive or on your object, that typically is a sign that your geometry is not clean. So just be aware of that. So I'm going to then add my divisions, right? Now, when you add the divisions, let's just try to do a minimum of, let's just do 5. So we have, what you want to have is that every angle, you're going to have an edge. Because remember, we want to keep the minimal amount of geometry as possible to make it easiest on ourselves. Okay, everyone got that? Yes.
So as of right, mine is still just a straight line. How did you get yours?
Okay, so I'm going to do it again. So I'm going to hit. So what we're going to do now is, so how do you think we could animate this? Do you guys have any ideas? So first of all, I'm going to go in and I'm going to just kind of clean this up. So for example, this gets really thin here, right? Because my edge is at a very weird angle. So you can just double click the edge and then hit E to rotate it, right? So it's like more, so you have a better, almost like the same thickness all the way throughout. I'm going to do the same thing over here, right? I have an extra edge here that I don't need, so I'm going to delete it. And if I delete an edge, do you guys remember what I have to do?
Delete the vertex.
Right, so I'm going to go to vertex mode and just delete those extra ones. So that way I have a clean geometry. So I could go in and basically start selecting all these vertexes and start animating them, right? So I could save it here. I could then move it and save it. And that'll basically create an animation, right? But that's gonna, like, right now I only have 5, but imagine if I had like a lot of them. It would kind of be a pain. So one thing that we can do is we can use clusters. Clusters are a way to group geometry within geometry. So if I select these 4 edges, right, these 4 vertices, so I want to make a cluster for each kind of pivot point. So I want to kind of turn these into like a joint is the idea. So each 4 of these vertices are going to be a joint. So if I'm going to select these 4, and if you go under, I think it's, anyone sees cluster. We're looking for cluster. Okay, under deform. So now we're starting to get into like more complex animation stuff. So under deform, you have what's called a cluster. So you notice that now that turns to a C, right? So I create a cluster. So now anytime I want to select all 4 of those, all I have to do is select that C, which the object's getting in the way. So this might be a good time to talk about the outliner. I typically start with this, but basically this outliner on the side, this is everything that's in your environment, right? So we have our 4 cameras. We have our starting out cube, our curve, and now we have this cluster. So if we're having trouble selecting the cluster, you can either select everything and then deselect the object, or you can just go over and select the cluster handle and the outliner, which I think is easier.
Is that like what layers is in AutoCAD?
Kind of, yeah. But this will automatically create the layer, like it's just all of your objects in the scene. So I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna create a cluster for every single pivot point. So let's go ahead here, and I'm gonna hit G on the keyboard because the last thing I did was cluster, so I can just keep copying, right? So vertex G, it just saves you time. G, and then the last 4 G. So now what I have is all of these cluster handles, right? I have one cluster handle 1, I have 2, I have 3, 4, and 5, and 6. So what I can do is now I can actually animate these clusters instead, which is going to be a lot more faster. So I can move this one and I can save it. And now I have this animation just using that one object instead of animating 4, right? So what can I use this for? So I can use this, so we can use this as a rib system. So let's say we're going to make a tower, right, or a skyscraper, and this is like our exterior facade. So what we can do is we can select all of these clusters, and we can start to animate them. So let's say we know this is our first level, so we want to keep this here. So we're going to say S on the keyboard, and let's say for every frame we have a foot, or maybe, I don't know how you want to do this. You can divide it however you want, but I'm just going to put this at, let's say, 60. I'm then going to move these up. And in addition, I am going to select each one of these clusters and start to modify them. So let's select cluster 2. I'm going to move this one out wider. Cluster 3, I'm going to move this out wider. 4, wider. 5, wider. And then maybe 6, I'm going to pull forward. So I'm going to select all of these now in the outliner. And now that, because I'm on frame 60, I'm going to hit S. So what this does is now it's going to animate my object between the two using just the clusters. Why is this important? So we haven't talked about it yet, but we want to use motion trails. So if I want to change, let's say each frame is a floor. So maybe on the 30th floor or the 30th frame, I want to modify this. Well, it becomes really kind of a pain to change it here and then see how it's going to affect the whole final form. So what I can do is if you select your original object, or if you select all of these objects, all of the clusters, under Visualize, you notice that there's no Visualize here. Now we're getting into the Animation tab. Under Visualize, we have something called Editable Motion Trail. So I can hit Create Editable Motion Trail, and now this is basically my my trail, right? So this is like the keyframes of my object. So each point on this motion trail represents the keyframe. So right now, this is 60 is like this point here, and 1 is this point here, right? So if I change this, I'm basically changing keyframe 60 without having to select anything. I can just select that. So it's not as powerful with 2. It's more powerful if you have multiple keyframes. So let's go ahead and make those. So I'm just going to undo. And I'm going to switch. I'm going to make maybe a keyframe at 120. And here I'm going to maybe move this up. Let's say a lot. And then I'm going to maybe move this one back in. This one back in. This one back in. Maybe this one goes out. This one goes out. Maybe this one goes out. Right? So if I hit now S, so now I'm going to have this. So now let's see what happens whenever I do Visualize Editable Motion Trail. Now I can start to see how these things will be affected, right? So I can move this, and then when I move my animation back, it's going to now follow that line, right? So I can move this one, it's going to follow that line. So it updates basically in real time accordingly. So now I have kind of like, in a way, a sweep, right? So we haven't talked about it yet, but you can do something called an animation snapshot. So for example, if I was to have a cube, and I was to create a simple animation of this cube, you guys don't have to do this part. Let's say I was to move it, and let's say I was to rotate it a bunch of times. And then maybe I scaled it a bit. Then I S, right? I get an animation like this. If I go to Visualize, Create Animation Snapshot, when you do this, make sure that you're changing the original default, because it only does one frame. You have to click on the box. And instead of start to end, I want the time slider. I'm going to get all of those animations in between, right? So I can create really complex geometry really fast just by using animation. So what is the benefit of that for us for this? Well, in our case, what do you think we can do with this? We already have the animation, so if we create an animation snapshot, we're going to get all those ribs, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to select the object, we're gonna go. So just be careful when you're doing this. In this case, you don't want to select the clusters because what we're creating the animation of is this whole object. So make sure you select the cube. You're gonna go to visualize, and then you're gonna do create animation snapshot. And now we have our ribs. So they're really close together. So what I'm gonna say is basically maybe redo it and do it with, right now it's increments of 1. Let's do maybe increments of 2 and hit snapshot. So what we have now is our rib system, and we have the editable motion trails. So we can go back at any time on these trails, right? And we can start to modify them, and everything updates. So you just created basically a parametric structural system for your building, right? And you can animate